Hello, welcome back to the World Politics Show. So today we're going to wrap up our discussion of liberalism with a third variant called commercial liberalism. The idea is pretty simple. It's that the rise of economic interdependence, where countries trade more with one another, invest more with one another, they share information, the movement of people across borders. All of these things bring mutual gains and lessen the likelihood of war. Now, how does that work? Well, first of all, let's look at uh, have we in fact seen the rise of intensifying interdependence? Well, it's varied over time. You see here that this shows the value of exports as a share of global GDP, so global economic output. And you'll see that across the 19th century, trade became a bigger and bigger share of global output up until about the early 19th century, early 20th century. And then the two world wars and the Great Depression led to a radical decline in interdependence, or globalization as we often call it today. So we had this first era of interdependence or globalization that then was basically disrupted by war and economic downturn. Then after World War II, you start to see an increase in trade as a share of global output, pretty stark increases, a slight decline in the the early 80s, and then shifting back upward, even at a more dramatic pace, until 2007, and then or 2008 actually, with the global economic crisis of that year, uh, you saw a significant downward jag in trade as a percentage of GDP. It recovers, but not quite up to where it had been. And as you see, um, up to 2014, there was even a slight decline. And I think it's declined more since then. We've certainly seen in the last 5 months, I'm talking to you now in mid July, um, the effect of the coronavirus has decimated world trade. It's dropped by a considerable amount as global supply chains get disrupted. Of course, the movement of people even more disrupted. Um, so the globalization, uh, if it is a mechanism for peace, then we have to ask ourselves if the disruption of starting with coronavirus, we're really starting in 2008, and then worsening under the coronavirus, is that if this disruption leads to some period of deglobalization, uh, similar to what happened with the two world wars and the Great Depression, then will that make for a more warlike world, a more dangerous world as well? Now, the basic argument there is just that as countries depend upon one another more for economics, as the pie grows bigger, they have more mutual interest and have the costliness of war grows. But there's another related argument that focuses on how the economies have changed over time, and how that relates to war. So let's go back and think about the 17th, 18th century, even into the 19th century, when in European countries where war was frequent, they were not world wars, they were small, relatively small conflicts, often carried out by mercenaries or small groups of aristocratic, um, you know, nobles. But nevertheless, there was constant kind of warfare among different kingdoms, with land shifting back and forth as kings or emperors tried to expand their holdings. In those days, people often didn't know who their ruler was, um, and you could have changes in who the land might move from one king to another, and the peasants might not even be aware of it. But why were there so many? Why was war so frequent, even though it was relatively low level? Um, well, one reason is because these were agrarian economies. There was no, um, industrialization at that point. There were, of course, there was, there were handiworks and craftsmen production of things like clothing and tools and things like that, but no mass production of industrialized goods. So the vast majority of economies consisted of growing food or cows or things like that. So in this kind of world, you ask yourself, in that sort of economy, what is the most important resource? Well, it's land. Land is key to an agrarian economy, obviously. And so if you want to have more power and wealth, then as a ruler, you need to expand the amount of land and the population to work the land. So that's why, land was a source of great contest among different rulers. But if we move forward into the industrial era, then there are two things that change. First of all, technology becomes more important than land as you develop science, you develop the technology of mass production and replaceable parts, assembly lines, that sort of thing. So a single factory can, produce as much as, a whole country worth of craftsmen in the past. And industry becomes a growing share of the economy, whereas agriculture becomes a smaller share in terms of the value of output, but also in terms of the amount of labor that goes into raising food. So first of all, land becomes of less importance. A country that has, advanced industry like Japan doesn't have much land, doesn't have much natural resources, but it has technology and it has industry and sufficient labor to work it, so it's very wealthy. So even small countries that didn't have much land could still be, could in the industrial era become very, very powerful and certainly wealthy. And in fact, countries that relied still heavily upon just agriculture or raw materials often fell behind. So it became less important to grab land from other countries. In fact, the way in which you grew your wealth was by producing industrialized goods and then trading them with one another. So each country would specialize in certain kinds of production and then trade for the goods that other countries produced more cheaply. So trade became a way for you instead of war to grab land, you engage in trade to maximize mutual gains. Now we saw this in a sense. If you look at Germany and Japan, for instance, before World War II, these countries carried out warrior state strategies. In other words, they tried to become more powerful and wealthy by grabbing territory. Germany, of course, tried to grab much of Europe and even Russia, and whereas Japan, much of Southeast Asia and China. And yet those strategies failed. They provoked opposition and resistance and war, led to war in which both countries were defeated and occupied and lost all of the land that they had tried to gain. So that didn't work very well. After World War II, both countries became trading states. They basically greatly limited their military. They didn't seek to conquer land or to colonize other countries. Instead, they just traded and focused on industrial development. and they're very successful. So that's an example of how the changing economic structure, Germany and Japan were trying to play by the old rules of the agrarian age, where raw materials and land were most important, when in fact we were already well into an industrial age where those things were not as important to a country's fate as technology and industry. Now, there was a third shift, which is the information economy. So here you go from agriculture to industry to now the biggest share of advanced countries' economies is the service sector. And the service sector is predominantly dominated by information flows. So information becomes the key resource rather than either land or industry. Now, if you think about it, you can conquer a piece of land and put it under production. You can even take a factory, and you can point a gun at somebody's head, and tell them to shovel coal, right, into the furnace. But if you conquer an information-based economy and try to make it profitable, you run into a problem. Is that the key resources are information and creativity, and those are very hard to capture through conquest. You can put a gun to the head of a computer programmer and say, write some awesome code, but it's likely that you're not going to get much out of that exercise. And in fact, if you conquer an information-based economy and you leave all the information infrastructures in place that make it, wealthy, those same information infrastructures can be used to organize resistance to conquest. It makes it easy for and in fact, you saw in the Arab Spring, you saw in Hong Kong recently, that when people who are resisting government share information freely, it's easy for them to organize resistance. Now, you could do what eventually happened in Egypt, which is you can shut down those information networks and make it hard for people to organize. But if you do that, then you're also destroying the economy. So conquest is no longer profitable. And that's the main, point of this argument, is that conquest was profitable under agrarian in the world where most states depended upon agriculture. It could be profitable sometimes in an industrialized world, but it was less so. Not only because land was unnecessary to become wealthy, but also remember, industrialization meant you could equip mass armies now. You could churn out weapons and bullets and tanks and planes that made warfare not, the small scale, low level, less costly kind of the 18th and 17th, 18th century where you had mercenaries or nobles. Instead, you had mass armies that could be equipped on a mass scale to carry out mass destruction. And of course, when we get to the nuclear age, then it's even more so. So war becomes less profitable, more costly. And then when you get to the information age, it becomes, almost impossible to imagine profiting from the conquest of an information-based economy. So the economic incentives for conquest have basically shriveled away. So what is putting these together, what is the liberal path to peace? We said that liberals believe in progress. First of all, the rise of economic interdependence, combined with the spread of democracy, combined with the growth of international institutions, from a liberal perspective equals fewer interstate wars, as well as more international cooperation. Now we can actually, look and see, is that true or not? Well, this chart shows us the battle death rate in state-based conflicts by it shows us by type, different colors. So civil wars are in sort of the yellow and the orange, and then the darker are interstate wars or colonial wars. So the big picture is that you've seen up and down a kind of jagged line, starting back in with World War II. Obviously, there was an enormous expansion of conflict there, and then that declined in the 50s. There was another jump in warfare in the 1970s. It declines by the end of that decade, jumps back again, but in the 1980s, but then declines, a small jump in around the turn of the century. But notice with each peak, it gets lower and lower until from about early 2000s on, almost the last 20 years, look how low the level of warfare is, the level of battle deaths. These are battle deaths per 100,000 people. So there's a pretty clear trend of declining death rate in war. This shows the average number of interstate conflicts per year by decade, 1950 to 2011. If you look at the red bar, those are interstate conflicts, and that have at least 1,000 battle deaths or more, so significant wars. You see a kind of a rise from 1950s to the 70s, and then a decline in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. If you just look at all wars, including the smaller ones, the peak is in the 80s, but you still see a decline in the 90s and the 2000s. The period from 2000 to the present is, remarkably peaceful. So we have growth of interdependence, growth of democracy, growth of international institutions. We have declining war. Looks pretty favorable, right? Well, is reversal possible? Is this a trend that we can count on, or is it something that is likely to continue or not? Well, you'd have to look. Do we see any signs of ebbing democracy? How about a slowing or reversal of globalization? How about a weakening of international institutions? This is not quite a measure of democracy, but it's closely related. It's a measure of political freedom. A organization called Freedom House gives scores, and it tries to measure the number of what this is measuring is the number of policy changes that either expand freedom or restrict freedom. And it looks at the number of countries where the number of policy changes that were that led to more freedom are in blue, and the number that led to less freedom in kind of this orange color. And so you can see that the number of, the expansion of freedom was growing in the early 2000s, but then about a decade ago, you saw a pattern where pretty marked, the number of countries restricting freedom, the number of changes restricting freedom came to far outweigh the number where freedom was growing. And we've seen that in general, that the number of democracies has declined, but even more so, the quality of democracy. So even countries that might still be democratic are less democratic than they once were. This shows a selection of countries whose score on a democracy index fell in recent years. What about globalization? You can see that the red line shows the growth of trade. You can see it grew. It fell in the financial crisis. Then it started growing again. If we looked at, this takes us up to 2013. If we looked at recent evidence, we would see in the last couple of years a slowing of trade, and then in the last half year a pretty big decline. So certainly it's not growing as fast as it was, and this is the second major disruption in the past decade, a little bit more than a decade. And then what about international institutions? This is a kind of a scorecard which experts were asked to look at different kinds of areas of international cooperation. It's a little hard to see, but they tried to give a kind of report card on how well countries were doing in organizing cooperation in these areas. And you can see there's more C's and a couple D's than there are B's, and there are no A's. The overall grade the experts gave was a C minus. So that's not great. In general, the United States has been pulling back on its commitment to international institutions. We withdrew from some major treaties under the Trump administration. We're threatening to pull out of, we just pulled out of the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic, and we're threatening to pull out of the World Trade Organization. So international institutions are certainly under strain as well. All of which is to say that we shouldn't take for granted the progress that has been made over the last century. Now here's one more slide. I believe this is the last slide. And this puts in somewhat perspective the decline in the amount of battle deaths and the decline in the number of wars. So what this does is it looks at the red lines. Well, first of all those little circles are wars, and the size of the circles indicate the number of the size of number of fatalities, military plus civilian. And then the position on the x-axis on the far left side is the rate of deaths per 100,000 people. So the circles that are very high meant that there was a high death rate, and circles that are near the bottom are low death rate. Now, the red line shows military plus civilian death rates on a 15-year moving average from 1400 to 2000. So one thing that's noticeable here is that the death rate between 1400 and about 1600 was reasonably steady, right? It's fairly flat there. It's up and down a little bit, but there's no obvious trend upward or downward. And the variation was within a fairly small spectrum. But then you see in the 17th century a huge jump up to a peak, followed by a valley, followed by another peak, another valley, another peak, another valley. Early 19th century, another peak, another valley, and then another peak, another valley, and then the peak of World War I, a valley in between, and then World War II, and then a decline. So the decline since World War II is significant. If you look at the blue, that's just the military death rate. That's even more impressively downward. But notice that the peaks and valleys, you have a peak, and then it's about 50 to 70 years before you get to the next peak. A peak, 50, 70 years, next peak. So we had a peak, World War II. It's been about 70 years. The question is this a long-term trend that will produce peace? Will the number of deaths, the amount of war, level out at a low, much lower than we've seen over the last, 400 years? Or are we just in a trough now, and we'll see it in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we'll see another peak? And if we see another peak, will it be a peak as big as World War II and World War I, or even larger, or will it be something less than that? So, if you were to take yourself back to any of these periods where we saw troughs, where we saw valleys, the rate of war had declined, it would be very easy from that perspective to think, we've solved the problem of war. Peace is at hand. We've learned from lessons. We know how to keep the peace now. But then it would turn out that was premature. It was followed in short order by another peak of violence and death. So, are we simply, if we tell ourselves that liberalism is right, that war and conflict, we've learned how to solve them through trade and democracy and institutions, are we fooling ourselves? Are we simply telling ourselves a nice fairy tale, or is it something real? All right, so we're going to stop here. Now you have a good grounding in both liberalism and realism. We're going to talk about some other theories in a little bit less depth, but these are sort of the two major ones that dominate the field of international relations. Take care.